Probably my favorite decade is the 1970s. I love the 70s. I miss the 70s. There's so much I miss about the 70s. I could talk about this. I could do an entire series on why the 70s may be the greatest decade in the history of our land. But I'll just share a few things that I miss about the 70s. First of all, I miss TV from the 70s. It was so simple back then. We only had 3 stations, folks. 3 stations. I know it's hard to believe. And this was before the advent of cable TV and Xfinity and all of that fun stuff, the dish you have in your house. We didn't have that. But you know what we had? We had what we called rabbit ears. Rabbit ears. That's right. Some young people are looking at me right now. Their eyes are like, whoa. So rabbit ears were these metal antennas that sat on top of your TV set with the whopping 3 stations, okay? And they would help you get reception so you could get a more clear picture. But what would happen would be you'd be watching TV with your entire family, watching the same thing at the same time without the distraction of other screens. There was only one screen, one TV. You watch TV, and the picture's kind of getting all fuzzy and all wonky, and your mom or dad would say, hey, Ben or Ed, Ed's my older brother, go up and fix the antenna. So we would go up there and we would try to adjust the antenna to make the picture better. And if it didn't get better, someone would have the brainiac idea, go into the kitchen and get some tin foil. And we would put tin foil like we're making something and squeeze them on top of the antennas of our TV set. And as we're doing that, sometimes the reception would get really good and your parents would say, okay, don't move. Don't move. Stay right there as we finish watching the Beverly Hillbillies. Well, doggies. So I miss the simplicity of 3 stations. I miss the fun of kind of being a techno genius by holding the antenna in place. I miss that about the 70s. Another thing I miss about the 70s were the telephones, okay? Back then, check this out, young folks, we had telephones that had wires connected to them that would go inside the wall of your home. And long 12-foot, 15-foot, 35-foot cords so you could talk with your telephone all around the house. Quite amazing, huh? And we only had 2 colors of telephones back in the 70s, if you were alive back then, if you remember that. And there was that one color, it was pea green soup. Do you remember? Yes, you do. You remember those colored phones? And then if you didn't go for the pea green soup colored telephone, you would opt for the beautiful mustard yellow telephone. That's it. That's all we had to offer. So we're sitting there watching TV with the rabbit ears and the tin foil, and one of the kids standing up next to the TV, bringing in that excellent, clear HD reception, and the phone would ring. Ring, 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 ring. And after about the 3rd ring, someone would say, is anybody going to get that? Ring, ring. Is anybody going to get the call? Is anybody going to get up and answer that call? And we had options. We had to get up and answer the call, or we could sit there and ignore it. But check it out. If we ignored the call, there was not an answering machine. No one had answering machines unless you were really rich or you're a doctor, okay? No one had that. So the phone's ringing, you could ignore the call. Or if you're really, savvy, you could go up, take the phone off the hook. It would make this rancid noise, and then the other person would get a busy signal. That was an option. Or you could actually pick up the call. Now here's what was weird about the call. You didn't know who's calling. It could be anybody. Caller ID did not exist. So there was a mystery to going to the phone, those beautifully colored phones, and picking them up and finding out who was on the other end of the line. The question was, who was going to get up off the sofa, let go of the antenna, and answer the call. Now, as you look at different epochs of history, as you look at the history of our nation or of the great state of Texas, you have people, men and women, at some point in their life who felt a unique and special call. And they felt like they had to answer that call. So what I want to talk to you about today is just that. What does it mean to have a call on your life? What does it mean to answer that call? Or what does it mean to ignore that call? What is the price that you will pay? So put that call on hold for a second, and let's talk about evil and suffering. Evil and suffering. If people ask me, what's the most difficult question that I get asked by skeptics, people who say that they don't believe in a God, what's the most difficult question they ask me? I would say, without a doubt, it's the problem of evil and suffering. If there is a God, He's a good God and a wonderful God and a powerful God, why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? But I would say this, it is a problem for people who believe in God, but it's a much larger problem for people who don't believe there is a God. Because if there is no God, then why is the problem of evil, good and evil, why is that a problem? Good and evil doesn't really exist. But it is a problem. And as we look at the story we're going to talk about today involving a call, we see a group of people, good people, godly people, who are in a time of immense oppression, suffering, and misery. If you have a Bible, you can turn to the second book in the Bible, the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter number 3. So it goes Genesis, then Exodus. If you didn't bring a Bible, then the words will be on the screen right there in front of you. But in Exodus 3, we see the people that are crying out in misery, that are being oppressed, that are living in utter slavery. They're known as the Israelites, God's chosen people. The Egyptians had put them in shackles, check this out, for 425 years. So they are crying out to God, God, help us. God, rescue us. This is a mess. This is painful. This is bleak. This is dark. God, we need your help. And it says in Exodus 3, verses 7 and following, that God heard their cry. He saw the oppression they were living under. So God called someone. He called someone to get up off the couch and to go to Egypt to try to rescue his people and bring them out of slavery into the promised land. Now, the guy he called was a guy by the name of Moses. Moses. So Moses is not in Egypt. He's living in a land called Midian. He's working for his father-in-law. Brutal. His father-in-law is named Jethro. Can't make it up. It's right there in the Bible. So he's working for Jethro. They're in the farming business, the ranching business. He's just minding his own business, trying to live a simple life. And God calls him. He calls Moses to be a freedom fighter. He's calling Moses to rescue 1 million people from slavery. And what does Moses say? Does Moses get up and answer the call? What does Moses say? Look at Exodus 3, verse 11. It says, but Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? The phone's ringing. Ring, 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 ring. Moses answers the call, but says no. So in a sense, he refused the call of God on his life. Why did he refuse that call? First of all, he said, I don't have the gifts. I don't have what it takes. I feel inadequate. I can't do it. Second of all, Moses felt guilty. Why was Moses working for his father-in-law? Why was he in the far country of Midian? Why was he out in the ranching business? Because Moses grew up, remember, in Pharaoh's house. It's an amazing story. He grew up in Pharaoh's house. He was probably in line for the throne. He was part of the royal court, but he had killed an Egyptian. He saw one of his fellow Israelites being mistreated, and he killed the Egyptian. So he was a murderer. He was on the run in Midian. He thought his life was over. He was in hiding. But God still called him. But he said, no. Why? I feel inadequate. I'm not the guy. Why? I've got a past. How can God use me given my past? And then he said, I can't talk. I'm not a good speaker. You want me to get up and speak in front of 1 million people? You want me to go to the most powerful man in the world, Pharaoh, and address him and command him to let go of his labor force? I can't do it. So he refused this call of God on his life. Now, we can't judge Moses too harshly, can we? Because how many times in your life, or how many times in my life, have I heard God's calling? I've seen a need. I've seen a cry. I've seen misery, but I've chosen not to answer that call. Why do we do that? Stephen Pressfield is a writer. He wrote a book called The Art of War. And he talks about what prevents us from finishing, what prevents us from moving forward in a business venture or a creative process. And I want to relate what he said to answering and living out God's call on our life. So he says this. He says, this is who you are right now. Right? Here I am right now. This is who you are. This is who I am. And over here is who you could be. Who you are and who you could be. And in the middle, what prevents us from becoming who we could be is this force called resistance. Resistance. Moses had taken the external force of the powerful Egyptian Pharaoh and army. He had internalized it and was guilty of self-sabotage. Again, this is God calling him. This is not some random call from a friend or a relative or a telemarketer, right? This is God calling. Moses is telling God no. Moses is caving in to the big R of resistance. But that's what we all do. We have this potentiality in our life. And God wants to do something with that potential, with our life, with our gifts. But what stands in the way between who we are and who we could be is this force called resistance. Resistance. And resistance gets inside of our minds. Resistance gets inside of our heads, and it prevents us from taking those first steps to becoming who God intended for us to become, for answering and living out his call upon our lives. God's calling. God has a unique call on your life. And as we'll see in a little bit, there's really a call beneath the call, a deeper call, but we'll talk about that in a second. But God has a call on your life. There are needs, there's suffering, there's misery, there's oppression in this world, everywhere we look around us. And God has equipped us in unique ways, in different ways, to meet those needs. But to do that, we have to answer the call he has on our life. Why does God call? God doesn't have to call. God could be some laissez-faire deity way up there in the sky, way behind the universe, way up there at a distance. But no, God is a personal God. And God calls us, and God calls you because God cares. God cares. Jesus said he cares about the flowers in the field. He cares about the birds and the trees. How much more does he care for you? And he cares for you so much that he has a call on your life. And it's so critical that as we're living this life and trying to figure things out, that we embrace and listen and adhere the call of God on our life. Os Guinness, great thinker, great writer and scholar, wrote a book called The Call many years ago. And here's what he said about it. He said, in any and all situations, check it out, both today and tomorrow's tomorrow, God's call to us is the unchanging and ultimate whence, what, why, and whither of our lives. Calling is a yes to God that carries a no to the chaos of modern demands. Calling is the key to tracing the storyline of our lives and the unriddling the meaning of our existence in a chaotic world. Why are we here? What's the meaning of our lives? It's to answer God's call and follow it with great passion. We do not live in a closed system. We are not mere molecules in motion. We are men and women and young people created in the image of God, and we have been created and made to adhere and to answer a certain and specific call upon our lives. Moses refused the call. Moses went into the excuse business. But God kept on calling and calling and calling because he had his hand on the life of Moses. So what will Moses do? All right, we're going to skip over to the New Testament, Hebrews chapter number 11. Hebrews 11 tells us what Moses did. It said, by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Moses, way out there in the wilderness, in the desert, on the lam, price on his head, running from Pharaoh. God calls, and finally Moses submits to the call. Moses answers God's call on his life. And he becomes the MVP of the Old Testament and one of the greatest leaders in the history of the world. Moses. By faith, by trust, he chose to get up off the couch and answer God's call in his life. We have potentiality in our life that must be actualized, and we actualize this potential when God calls, and when God calls, and when God patiently calls yet again and again, we respond to that call. We choose. Moses made a choice. Am I going to hang out and live a trust fund life in Egypt, or am I going to be a freedom fighter and meet the real needs and misery of my people and pull them out of slavery and out of bondage into a promised land. What am I going to do? What's a greater reward? Short term, I'm sure he thought, maybe the nice trust fund life. Long term, eternally, 10,000, 1 million years from now, the reward is always to answer the call of God. And that is what Moses did. He answered the call. Now, the question for us here today and for you is, will you answer the call? Will you answer the call that God has on your life? Now, I'm not being grandiose for you or for me. None of us here, I doubt it, are going to have a call like Moses on our life. That's probably not going to happen. But we have a call upon our life that is God's unique call for our life. Sometimes your call is a vocational call. God has called you to be a teacher, or you feel like God has called you to be a coach, or God has called you to be a scientist, and God has called you to be an attorney. I have a friend of mine that was in the business world for many years. He was successful, and all of a sudden in midlife, his company was taken over by someone else, and he was laid off, and he didn't know what he was going to do next. So someone found him another job, a lucrative offer with another firm, but he also had an offer to teach at a college. So he had a choice. Do I take the money? Do I take the meaning in teaching? So he started teaching, and since he's been teaching and become a professor, he has found more fulfillment than he's ever known in his life. It's like he is now walking in his calling. God called me to do what I'm doing here today. I didn't want to do that. You say, well, you grew up in a preacher's home. Of course, you're going to be a preacher. I want to do the very opposite. I wanted nothing to do with it. But when I was young, on a retreat, I heard the voice of God, and I knew that he was calling me to do what I'm doing here today. Otherwise, trust me, I'll be doing something else. But by God's grace, I answered the call. By God's grace, my friend answered the call to teach. God has a call on your life. What is that call? Maybe you need to ask God, God, I want to know your calling on my life. I want to know what you're calling me to do. God, what is that call on my life? Maybe your call is not in the vocational realm. Maybe your call is something to do with ministry and helping and serving people in the context of the local church. And you say, hey, that's my call. God, what is my call? What is my call? I don't want to miss it. I don't want to sit there by the TV and sit there on the couch and go through the motions of life and miss your call upon my life. Moses answered the call. Will you answer the call? And underneath the call, there is that deeper call, isn't there? There's the call within the call. In other words, God may call you to a minister, to a vocation that's special and unique for you, but God calls all of us to that deeper call of character, to that deeper call of being conformed to the image and the likeness of Christ. Moses, we saw in Hebrews 11, he endured ill treatment. He looked forward to the reward. He was developing these Christ-like qualities of humility and courage and strength as he was living out his big call. There was that deeper call of being conformed to the image that God had for him and God has for us. God calls because God cares, and God cares who we become. There's being who you are, and there is becoming who you're growing into be as you respond and follow God in Christ. That's the difference between Moses 1.0 and Moses 2.0. That's the difference between him being the best version of himself It's him answering the call of God and answering the deeper call of allowing God to develop that character inside of him. But he first had to answer the call. When I was growing up in North Carolina as a little tyke, very small town called Canton, North Carolina, there was a mill, a paper mill, where most people worked in that town. The paper mill just spewed out pollution. It smelled. I probably have poor sinus to this day because of that. Whole nother story, but it was still a beautiful town. It was in the mountains of North Carolina, and people lived all around each other. There were big pine trees and rolling hills, and when we go out and play in the yard, and as the sun was setting at the end of the day, the parents, you could hear them yelling and calling for their kids from different homes. And little by little, my friends would go and they would leave whatever we were doing or what fort we were making, and they would go to their home. But there was one guy in our group, his name, we called him Harkins because that was his last name, Mike Harkins, which I think is a great name for someone out of your childhood. It just works. So we called him Harkins, and Harkins had a dad who worked in the paper mill, and he would come up and, it's kind of getting dusk, and we would see this little light, flickering in the distance. And we knew that was Mr. Harkins, taking a drag off of his non-filtered Camel cigarettes. And he would say in a very deep, raspy voice, after breathing in chemicals and then, chasing it with cigarettes all day, Mike would go, "Sir, come home." And Mike Harkins knew to drop everything he was doing and to come home to his father. Why did he do that? Other parents have been calling, other voices have been calling, but he didn't go until he heard Mike. Until he heard his dad's voice, his father's voice. That unique voice and that unique call is what he responded to. If God the Father is calling you, it's my prayer and challenge to you that you would pick up the phone and answer his call on your life.